You know, everyone who engages in a work of passion does so for reasons that ultimately are deeply autobiographical. And Manning is that phenomenon writ large. He said that the history of Australia could be summed up as a struggle between three great forces, three great ideas. What he called the Enlightenment, by which he meant basically secular liberalism, Catholicism and Protestantism. And they were the three ethoses that were wrestling phenomenons in the white Australian story. And really, they were the three great influences that were wrestling phenomenons in Manning Clark. And that struggle that he was engaged in was a struggle he waged by telling the history of Australia. It is a profoundly autobiographical work in that he's thinking through big questions on a national scale so that he can come to some kind of understanding or reconciliation of the great contradictions that are at work in him. It is grandiose if you're hostile to Manning and epic if you're sympathetic. And I have come to think of Manning Clark as a great artist. I'm not sure whether he's a great historian, but I know that he's a great artist. And, you know, there are passages of that history, especially of volume 4, which is where the really charismatic stories are, that show Manning at his most powerful as one of the great writers and thinkers and teachers of the colonial or the white Australian tradition, and I love him for that. In the 70s, Manning became a major figure in Australia. He really entered into public life, especially around the election and then the sacking of the Whitlam government. He championed Whitlam as a kind of Moses figure who had appeared from a cultural wilderness and could lead the Australian people forward to a promised land. And Manning puts history centre stage in the Australian conversation, and he does it in a way that's unprecedented because his predecessors, by and large, had told the white Australian story as if it was a manifestation of Britishness. We were a fine flower of the empire. And Manning purported to be hostile to the empire and all its institutions and all its pomp and circumstance. He purported to be in solidarity with the men and women who stood in the outer at a game of Australian rules footy. In fact, he really stood out at a game of Australian rules footy. There was no one else there like him because he was there in that, you know, iconic hat and that strange sort of costume he developed for himself. Not at all like a working man enjoying a footy match. But that's where his heart was, this belief in the democratic destiny of Australia as a nation, and he becomes the poet to that destiny, and he helps us to believe that we have that in us, that Australian stories have the kind of grandeur, the tragedy, the humour, the courage and the spiritual capacity for redemption that no other historian had invested them with before.